Hugo, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to have you here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, yeah.
Firstly, I just wanted to ask, if there's someone who's not really at all familiar with neuroscience, could you explain what neuroscience is exactly and perhaps include those kind of like the particular different kinds of it? Because I know that you're a cognitive neuroscientist, so...
Yeah, in a very simple terms, neuroscience is the study of the brain and the nervous system, like anything to do with that in the sense of how it works. So, people study humans in society, but as soon as you're getting down to questions about the way the brain and the nervous system is working, that is the domain of neuroscience. And the different sections in it, you'll have cellular neuroscientists who are studying the mechanisms within the cell, the molecular systems, fantastic work. And you'll have it all the way up through to people working on philosophical questions around neuroscience about what it means, the way the brain works in particular ways. And in between, you'll have people working on, say, systems neuroscience, how do individual neurons and groups of neurons work, and cognitive neuroscientists who, like myself, are interested how the way in which we think or aspects of our cognition relate to brain function. And then you have computational neuroscientists that are interested in the mechanisms. And I like to integrate many of these different approaches, but less so the cellular, which is mostly what I trained in, and not so much the philosophical, more the meat in the middle, I'd say.
If you were to explain the difference between neuroscience and psychology, obviously there is one. Could you maybe explain that difference and then maybe talk about how they can overlap those subjects as well sometimes?
Sure, no, it's a great question. So I'd say psychology is the broad study of like the human mind, how our cognition works, aspects of mental function. These are all other terms like the word psychology. So I'm just adding in other terms to try and describe that. So if you're interested in how memory works or how we attend to the world or how we make decisions, all of those things, those questions would be considered psychological questions. And obviously psychology spreads into things about how we relate to our parents and the bonds we form with people and questions of consciousness and very broad questions about how we operate typically as humans, but also other animals, interested in how they behave and what they do. Whereas the neuroscience is saying, you're studying the memory, how memory works, but what is the mechanism underlying that in terms of what are the cells within the brain doing that give rise to memory? And there's a lot of overlap between those questions. So cognitive neuroscience is a good example of an intersection between questions about cognition and questions about neuroscience that come together.
Do you remember the first time you became interested in kind of the human mind or human behavior or the brain, anything like this?
That's an interesting one because that's like I have to go back to my memories of childhood and think. Certainly, my parents would take me to lectures occasionally, like in the science festival, not like a public lecture. I remember one Stephen Rose gave about brain systems in Edinburgh. This is where I grew up in Edinburgh, and that I remember finding that particularly interesting. That he would talk about the brain and what was happening. I don't remember the full details of it, but I remember being able to thank him years later at a meeting at the Royal Society, and he was very excited to hear that his lecture in a festival had kicked off a career of a neuroscientist. But yeah, I think my fascination with it was then reading more popular science books as a teenager. In the late, before you go into university, I started reading books, and one of those was The Astonishing Hypothesis by Francis Crick, and thinking, this is amazing. This is what I'd like to do.
You did a degree and I think also your PhD at UCL where you are now. Could you kind of speak a little bit about how you decided to do that at university? Was it obvious after those early experiences and when you were a teenager you wanted to do that? What kind of made you be sure you want to get into this world?
I left school, joined University College London. I've stayed within that institution. I've been institutionalized to some extent, other than periods at Cambridge University and the Karolinska at Sweden. I've continuously worked in London at UCL, University College London. And that's partly because of the people. People make a huge difference to life, I think. And UCL has surrounded me with just the best colleagues I could have wanted. And so going back, I was interested in a range of things. I was sort of torn between doing a neuroscience degree or philosophy and physics was the other option I was kind of contemplating. And the idea of learning lots of math at the same time as submitting philosophy essays when it came down to it practically filled me with a bit of yeah, I didn't think that was going to be such fun. And this is 1995 that I did my undergraduate, and neuroscience was really rising. There was a big groundswell in what was possible technique-wise. Functional magnetic resonance imaging had just become a big topic. There were lots of discoveries happening in the brain sciences. So it was partly there was a sort of zeitgeist at that time. And the idea of doing a degree in neuroscience is very specialized. A lot of universities don't offer that. But to me, would, in my mind, allow me to explore questions that were philosophical, psychological, and biological, all in one degree, which I felt if I'd just done a degree in biology, there wouldn't have been psychology or philosophy coming out there. As it turned out, I didn't cover philosophy once, I don't think, in the period, but it kept coming up. Lots of discussions around questions to do with philosophy would occur. But yeah, it was fantastic, and there were 13 of us on our undergraduate degree back then, so a very small cohort doing that degree in neuroscience.
Can you imagine at all where you'd be now if you had done physics and philosophy? Were you just about to take that because you're purely interested, or did you see that as the route to something else potentially?
Yeah, I was interested in having a broad career, and I still think there's a lot of. I was in a meeting yesterday where someone said, "Oh, you want to become a successful scientist? Do physics. It'll give you the best grounding in thinking and maths that you could want." And that was my approach, was thinking if I could get that grounding from physics and mathematics and thinking about the physical world, it would allow me to do lots of different things. And I'd really enjoyed physics at A level. So it was thinking about that, but thinking I didn't like the idea of just doing physics. I was also looking at doing natural sciences as a degree. Years later, I ended up being a tutor at UCL for natural sciences, so getting to see how that worked. But I didn't. I ended up choosing neuroscience because it was very compelling. Like the interview I had there, they basically said, it's going to be tough. If you do this degree, you're going to end up a scientist. Like everyone who's on this degree program, you're not going to end up in banking or something else. Everyone doing this is aligned. There's only 13 of you. So they were much more honest about the program than all the other universities I went to, saying, "Oh, it's going to be fantastic. Everybody's, and they would tell you what the great careers people went off to, which I wasn't interested in. So that was very compelling when they did the interviews back then for the undergraduate.
What was your PhD research and focus on?
Yeah, I was interested in how the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe, so these are bits in the middle of the brain, so like deep inside your brain, were involved in both episodic memory, so memory for events, and navigation, how we find our way. And the way I was looking at that in my PhD was to use very early, like the virtual reality that had been just really developed. So the games like Doom and Quake had come along this is back in the day. And the particular game that I was able to use was Duke Nukem. So this is a very 3D world, but very low-end graphics. Was a way of trying to build virtual worlds that you could systematically test patients who had undergone surgery or happened to have a brain injury, a lesion that affected these bits of the brain. And I wouldn't have been able to do all that amazing work if it wasn't for Neil Burgess, who was my supervisor at the time, had invited me in to do that. He had built these virtual environments, and it was my job to modify them, make the tests work, develop it, and then test these patients. So I was basically doing a PhD in neuropsychology, but with the joy of working with a computational neuroscientist. So Neil Burgess's main body of work is computational neuroscience, and it gave a very different flavor. And I had the chance to work with some fantastic clinical collaborators in my PhD. So this would be Farineh Varga-Kardem, who's at the Institute of Child Health. She was involved in some of the studies we were running, and other people at National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in Queen Square. So yeah, I really enjoyed my PhD.
You're now a professor of cognitive neuroscience. After you've done a PhD and you've done some research and you've been a lecturer, what does it take exactly to be assigned and be called a professor?
It's a bit like you just keep going on. And there's nothing actually magical about becoming a professor, in that you've just got to meet the criteria set out by the university. And you do go out for, you have to get, 3 or 4, I think probably 4 external reviewers who review your application to be a professor and say, yeah, this person should be a professor. And then the university board meet to decide who's a professor or not. And you kind of know, most people probably in a position where they know they should be a professor at the point they apply, or they're nudged to do it. And it is a useful thing in academia because it provides a sort of later in your career a sort of extra step to provide extra solidity, I think. So I found it a very useful thing to move to professor. Yeah.
Is this the kind of like pinnacle, like moment you want to reach in your career to become a professor? Does it feel like significantly a step up than all the other things you've been awarded before?
That's a great question. I think it is a really key moment actually when you are now a professor. Partly because you're given a topic. I think that's one of the nice things people don't talk enough about. So each of my colleagues, I had to run an event, and you have to work out what are they a professor of, which for most other professions you don't you're just you do this or you're a doctor, blah. So that's a nice aspect of it. But there's nothing really magical, I would say. And I think if you were thinking about a pinnacle of a career, it's probably discoveries. So it's not so much like accolades or titles. So great if you won a Nobel Prize, great if you're a fellow of the Royal Society. But if you ask those people what they're probably most proud of, it's not that. It's going to be, I made a discovery here that just changed the thinking. And often it's they'd expected something in the data and something else turned out that they've made something really unusual in their research, or they thought of something important and then proved that was the case. I think that's what most people would say the pinnacle of their career is the scientific discovery.
In your case, then on that point, what would be the discovery, or kind of maybe there's more than one discovery that you're kind of most proud of and you think has been most impactful?
As I said earlier, I've had a very within one institution career. I've worked in neuroscience from when I was a student, but I've had the joy of working on the topic of space, how we represent space. And the fun thing about working on how we represent space is that spills into lots of different domains. So I wouldn't say I've had one single discovery that's like I'll pin all my story on this one discovery as being the key. But if I pick out one recent example where we were, it was a really interesting discovery for us. So this goes back to 2016, where working with Deutsche Telekom or T-Mobile, they had funded a philanthropy, like a reach out branding exercise to work with us at University College London and Michael Hornberger at University East Anglia. And so Michael is an expert in dementia. I joined up with Michael. The aim of that project was, with the funding from Deutsche Telekom, could we make a new diagnostic tool to help assess problems with navigation that would be really useful in the case of Alzheimer's disease, where becoming disoriented is a very early symptom. And there's a lot of fantastic researchers out there studying this now. So the discovery I would want to talk about, if I said what's a recent interesting discovery, was using the app. We then created an app that called See Her Request, where you download the app, you play a little boat, you guide the boat round virtual worlds trying to find fragments of maps and piece them together. And as you're playing the game, we track where you are in this virtual world. And we asked people a number of questions. So one of the questions we asked is, did you grow up in a city, in a rural setting, or some mix? With the idea that, there are advantages to growing up in cities, and that there's, there can be complicated layouts. There's a lot of stimulating features, a lot of landmarks. But rural settings, you got to travel bigger distances. The environment looks more similar, maybe. So we weren't sure. There was no real strong literature on, is it better to grow up in a city or outside a city? And we found a dramatic, very clear effect in the data we'd collected that people on the whole around the world were worse at navigating if they'd grown up in a city. And so that was the first discovery. And so that was that people are taking longer to get to their target in our video game if they say they grew up in a city. And we were able to really hone in and really push the data because we've been able to collect data from 4 million people. The reason we've been able to collect data from 4 million people was that Deutsche Telekom had really invested in this project using their branding mechanism to advertise it, and to bring in a really fantastic games company, Glitchers Limited, who built a very high spec, a fantastic game. It got BAFTA nominated. It won 9 awards at the Cannes Festival of Creativity. They aced that side of it. And it just took a lot longer for the science to kind of roll out, as you'd expect. So it wasn't, so the discovery is not just, oh great, people who grow up outside cities do well. That's not what's so exciting, but it was the fact we had so much data we could hone in and find out that it's really the griddiness of cities, and really push that, and show that
Griddiness?
The griddiness.
What does that mean?
So the griddiness is, so if you imagine Manhattan in New York is one of the most famous gritty cities in the world. It's got a very, and you say, I want to go to 22nd Street, or we're on 9th Street. Let's just walk up the number of blocks. You're walking in a grid, so you can just sort of count how many turns you need to take. And there are a lot of cities in the world like that. Canada has the most gritty cities in the world, it turns out. The USA is very close behind, but Argentina has very gritty cities, it turns out. And then there are places in the world like Ireland, which has the most windy cities, Dublin, for example, you could imagine. And so it turns out that there's a very strong effect of this grittiness on navigation performance. There's people who grew up in cities in these countries that have got gritty cities, you really see a strong effect. And by effect, I mean that if we look at the world average across the nearly 500,000 people, and when we hone in on the data, there's a woman who grew up in a rural setting or outside a city will have a 10-year advantage over a woman who grew up in a city in terms of her ability. So that's quite a striking difference. It's not like and so you see this effect of early life getting bigger and bigger later into life. And, following up the research, we're also able to find out that it doesn't matter if you live in a city now. That doesn't affect the data. It's growing up in a city, that question. And so we're able to replicate the results in a follow-up study, show that it's not playing a boat, but if you drive a car in cities in a virtual simulation, you see the same effects. So that's one study. We were very fortunate to publish that in Nature in 2022, where, the reviewers were fantastic, guided us to do lots of really further analysis, more experiments. And it's a case in that of where, they were really worth it. The reviewers' questions really nailed extra things we needed to know.
Why was it you think there's that link between this kind of worse ability and the extent to which you were brought up in a city, especially a gritty city?
Yes, exactly. I should have clarified why that's an important, why that might be the case. And I think the answer comes that most environments we navigate aren't perfectly gritty. So if you grew up in Manhattan and you stay in Manhattan, you're good at it. We actually found that people who grew up in gritty cities tend to be slightly better at navigating gritty environments. So when we look at our video game, there were some more gritty environments, and they're slightly better. So for most scenarios, people who have grown up in gritty, so they are used to, when they've learned to navigate, to just thinking in terms of blocks and turns. But if there's a curving environment and you need to keep track of your changing direction, it seems like they won't be able to do that as well. So they're less able to do that. It's possible, we mentioned in the paper, there's some work showing that the way the brain represents the structure of the environment changes it, the way it codes the space when you go from open spaces to linear pathways. And so in a gritty city, you're mainly going down linear pathways, and it may be that actually changes the way in which their sort of internal compass, to use quotes, is organized and set up. But we won't know until some very difficult research gets done if that is the case. Yeah.
So it'd be better at navigating kind of grid-like cities. It's just that if you take the average of all places they can navigate, then they'd be worse because most are not.
Exactly. So a way to think about this is if you're going to go to somewhere in France, like Lyon, and you've got two people that take someone from Buenos Aires and someone from Dublin. Take the person from Dublin because they've grown up in a non-gritty. Person from Buenos Aires, if you want to navigate Manhattan, they're the one to pick over the person from Dublin on average. There's a lot of noise. You need to know a lot of other factors. But we were just surprised that the impact of cities is one of the stronger effects we've seen in this field of what individual differences can affect navigation skill.
Fascinating. Okay. I mean, we've kind of touched on it already, but if we were to kind of look at your research focus and kind of sum it up broadly, I think I saw you wrote online, I think this is either on your Twitter or your LinkedIn, that you said you explore in your work how we remember, navigate, and imagine space. Would that be a good summary of kind of mostly what you've been up to in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. Which is pretty broad. Yeah, exactly.
So let's maybe look at those like one at a time. I know they're obviously going to be very related, but you've got remember, navigate, and imagine space. Would it be fair to maybe like look at these a little bit one at a time? So what could you say you've learned and we understand about how humans and maybe animals as well are able to like remember space and what that means exactly?
Yep. So I'll take some example studies and say, here's an example of looking at remembering. So we took some college student, Anna Jaffapur was a collaborator a while back, and we were interested in how, when people had just moved to a new place and they just arrived, how does their sense of space emerge in this new place? In this case, by asking them to draw a map, to recall the space, and not navigate it, not imagine it, but just draw a map of your local environment. And we're curious about how veridical, like accurate people's maps were. And we found that the more familiar they were with the space, the bigger they drew it. So there's like a magnification. If it's like, here's the shops around me, here's the places I go, we'll draw them big. And if I've got to go to a tube station or like a subway station further away, it would end up being smaller, not well represented in their map. So it showed that there's a bias in the way in which, when we're recalling information and want to put it down in a drawing, that it gets magnified or, affected by the familiarity you have with the space. And that, oddly, humans are kind of odd in that if you say, well, how long will it take to get to that tube station that's kind of far away, this you're not so familiar with, and they'll be more accurate on estimating that than if you say, how quickly could you get to a certain place in your familiar space? Because they kind of shrink it when they think about time. It's familiar, it's no problem, I can get there easily. So there's a kind of weird bending of space in drawing maps and estimating time that doesn't just fit in a simple, well, everything gets stretched one way or compressed, and that's recalling space. If I look at navigating space, there's here you can look at navigating real space, virtual space, or imaginary space. So what I mean by that is we've done studies asking people to navigate around Covent Garden or the Montmartre area in Paris, and to see if we could predict from our video game how well they'd find their way, which we were able to do quite nicely. Show that if you're good at navigating virtual worlds, you'll be very good at navigating real worlds. So that's a kind of example of studying navigation in the field with, and predicting using GPS tracking. We've done a fair number of experiments. We've used virtual reality to simulate environments and look at the neural activity using fMRI. So with that, we can't get the neural activity. We can get at the hemodynamic, the blood changes and oxygen levels in the brain to make inferences about what's happening in our brain. And so there we've looked at a lot of work on how does the brain represent the direction and distance to where we want to go. Is there a guidance system doing that? So we can see, for example, the hippocampus seems to be quite interested in this, but also areas in our prefrontal cortex, the bits of the brain above our eyes that are really important for kind of decision making and planning. So that's kind of navigating. And then the last bit you've raised was imagination. So how do we imagine future spaces or imagine things? And depends how you frame that, but two experiments to take. One we've recently done is asking London taxi drivers, who I've spent some of my career working with. So these are the licensed London taxi drivers. They take 2 to 4 years to train to memorize 26,000 streets in London to get a green badge. Typically, that's the main badge they get awarded to pick up customers who hail them on the street. If you don't have this green badge, you can't pick up somebody on the street and charge them. And to look at imagining space, we asked them to give them 2 points in London and imagine all the streets between them. So sometimes that might be 30 streets. And we found the speed at which they can tell you the 30 streets is 1.8 seconds is the average speed of recall. They are utterly incredible. And it's partly, imagine they took 5 minutes to think that out. The amount of honking cars behind them as they're sitting with a customer there, it's just not plausible. So that job makes them extremely efficient. So we've been studying then, why are they really fast on some streets and very slow on others when they're imagining this journey they could take? And so far we can see it's the structure of the streets. A bit going back to the griddiness in cities, some bits of London are more gritty than others, but the way in which these streets are connected and flow together will predict the speed at which taxi drivers can imagine routes. And the last example of that is I've not only been able to work with London taxi drivers and brain imaging, but I've been able to record from cells in rats while they do experiments. So that's the more systems neuroscience side. And there we've been able to ask the question, does our brain, in this case, create a map of the future before we've been somewhere? In the sense of, if I imagine I'm going to go on holiday to Hawaii, say I've not been there, and if I'm thinking about it, I'm looking at brochures, I'm getting ready for it, I go to sleep the night before, is it possible my brain starts to restructure itself, ready to have a map that gets created when I do go to Hawaii the next day? So we weren't spending time studying humans going to Hawaii, but instead we were recording from rats as they ran up and down on a small island. Like we created a kind of platform they could run up and down where there's lots of food. So running around getting food. And then all we did was, instead of putting the food where the rats were, was to put it to a future island that they couldn't get to. They can see into this future island, and they can see another really boring island that's nothing happens there. And so what we did after they'd gone to sleep for an hour and record their brain is then record their brain whilst they go back to the original island, but put two bridges down. So that we make them run to the interesting island they saw before and run to the boring one. And now they get food on both. So there's nothing different with the islands that they get to go to. But what we were able to see was that the brain, the hippocampus in particular, this bit of the brain that's critical for spatial memory and navigation, would create a kind of map with the cells of the island of interest that it had seen with food in the future in the sleep period before it went there. And that to me is kind of quite an exciting kind of insight that when we go to sleep, our brains are very active. It's not like we're shut down. It's not like we've got anesthesia. Our brains are very, people love talking about their dreams. But in this case, what we're able to see is that the brain is structuring for the future.
Just to understand that a little bit more though, what does it mean exactly to kind of, as you sleep or beforehand, like preload a map?
It's a great question. So, and it's a little bit complicated to explain, but effectively within the hippocampus where we were looking, there are cells described called place cells, where each cell will get excited, it'll send action potentials, the main way these neurons send messages, when the animal or human is in a particular part of the environment. So I'm sitting right here at this table, there will be a whole group of cells in my hippocampus that are active, sending messages to other bits of the brain to say, I'm here now. If I close my eyes, if I turn around, lie on the floor, they don't care. They're just interested in the fact that I'm here in this space, so that my viewpoint doesn't matter. They're called place cells for that. If I walk to the other side of the room, a completely different group of cells will be active. If I go out my house, a new group will be active. What it means is that as we move through the world, there's a broadcast signal from the hippocampus saying, you're here. And it's organized, it's structured into a map, so that if I want to learn that's a bad place, don't ever go there again, the cells near that place can become linked to cells that tell you this is bad. Or you go somewhere fantastic for dinner, the cells, you can link together a reward with that map representation. So this is what won John O'Keefe a Nobel Prize in 2014 for discovering these cells at University College London. I'm very fortunate to work with him in my career. And he was joined by Edvard and May-Britt Moser, who also discovered other key cells that code space. But going back to the example of what do I mean by preloading a map, if I describe this table and walking out my door, the same thing is going on for those rats. As they run up and down in this island, which is a large platform, they're building a set of cells that tell them where they are throughout that island. And what scientists have thought before was, if you go somewhere new, you just build new things into your map, right? You've got a map of the world and you just add to it. So you add new cells in. But the idea that in our sleep, you might start to construct and stabilize future maps is a really interesting idea. And that's what we were looking at, is that can these cells get organized while you're sleeping? And it's just one of a number of impressive studies by other people. I'd say the other people's data is even really impressive work in this area, looking at how place cells read out information. So it's a very active community of people interested in how does the brain map space.
From your understanding and what you've learned about London, kind of Cabbie's ability to memorize these extraordinary, numbers of roads and locations and features around London, do you think this is something that that the typical person would be able to do? It's actually some of these people have a bit of a gift. What has it taught you about our ability to memorize things?
We've looked at that question. So first one to say is, there's no direct answer to that. We haven't run a study that says, this is the definitive answer. You have to have this gift to be a London cabbie. What a fantastic paper, one of my favorite papers in the field that I'm not an author on, but Katia Willett, working with Eleanor Maguire. So Eleanor Maguire at University College London was the first person to really make them neuroscientifically famous when she discovered that the posterior hippocampus of London taxi drivers was larger than non-taxi drivers. And she did a wonderful set of other follow-up studies. But this question that you asked about, what could all of us do that? She and Katia looked at a group of people who decided they would become taxi drivers. They trained, they scanned them before they started, they scanned them afterwards, and only the ones that qualified changed the size of their hippocampus. But importantly, there was no difference before they started. So it wasn't the size of the hippocampus that told you in advance, oh, this person's going to become a taxi driver. It was more the capacity of their hippocampus to change. More specifically, in recent work we've not published, I have tried to look at, could we use techniques that London taxi drivers use to take a group of people and try and enhance in a short moment, like just give them a toolkit to go into a new bit of London, try and learn it better and come out? And the answer was no. This just doesn't work. You have to really, I think, be dedicated to that task and know what you're doing and think, yeah, I really want to learn London and have a particular approach. So there are also these things called knowledge schools, where people pay to become taxi drivers. You sign up and they teach you how to think about learning to become a taxi driver. You don't have to sign up to a knowledge school, but their tricks and techniques will help you. But they don't do it in one session. It's like 2 to 4 years. So our experiment to do it in one afternoon with the average person, just did not work out. And I thought there might be some interesting things there, but we're still writing that up. I think the answer to this as well is a little bit like, if you're a really excellent navigator, I can teach you new things, but they're probably like an excellent athlete, only going to get you that little bit extra. If you really struggle to navigate and we can try and teach you some tricks, you might get a little bit better again, but you're not going to magically be an amazing navigator. It's quite a hard skill to actually fully modify, but there's certainly things you can do. So if I give you some examples, it's like looking behind you when you go. So if you go to a junction and you're learning a new place, if you don't look behind you, when you go back through it, you won't recognize it. It's just as simple as that. So being able to look around you more and take in the environment is important. And just in the field of memory, where people have studied what makes people learn things better, depth of encoding is a key across every material you could possibly think of, learning a new recipe, whatever it might be. So attending to the environment and thinking about it more deeply is going to allow you to navigate when you go back there. What I learned from taxi drivers is that if you can memorize the street names, it kind of gives you a power over the space, that I can literally unit-wise think through a journey by naming it. And you get this kind of sense of ownership of, they feel like they own London on one level. They know it. It's like they're living. Many of them would say, London is like my living room. I don't think about where St Pancras Station is. It's just, for me, there. It's like the armchair. And I think if you could take that approach to learning, I would just say it's very hard. Like memorizing street names requires, effort. And they use tricks, like they'll create stories, like using, mnemonics and things to learn routes. So one they used to say was east to west, embankment best. So always take the embankment when you're going from east to west. Don't bother going through. Whether that's true anymore, I don't know, but it was something I was told years ago. Follow the yellow brick road when in doubt, which was the old A to Z map. The main roads are all yellow, and it would be a backup plan. But no, they pride themselves on what they do. It's an utter joy to work with licensed London taxi drivers.
What is it about this area that you're so fascinated about, and you've kind of not pivoted off so much into other things? What's kept you working in this space for so long?
Yeah, I think I'm fascinated by the way in which people think about space and the way we represent space. And I think for me, if you think about the world as kind of space, time, and other stuff, in a philosophical and a physics kind of sense. And time is really hard. It's not that easy to measure and get into. But space is very measurable, and it links to many things. So I've been able to use that to look at how people think about space in architecture, in art, and how the brains of rats represent space. And for London taxi drivers, just how they do that, how they use their brains, for me it sort of gives interesting insights into the general brain function. And I just quite like exploring. I like going out. I actually quite like when I'm not sure and I make a mistake and I think, how did that happen? And I've always been interested in maps. So this has kept me linked to maps. A lot of people say study memory, which I find generally interesting, but I find memory for word lists very boring. So when it comes to like what would be interesting, it's maps. They're quite fun. And the recent work it's led me into has been really fantastic, where we've had a chance to collaborate with Micronesian sailors who live down in the Pacific, where London taxi drivers, sure, they make a couple of errors and their customers annoyed that they didn't get them there as efficiently. But if you're sailing without GPS, like the taxi drivers don't use GPS in London, but if you're sailing in the ocean in the Pacific and you miss by 0.2 of a degree, you'll die, because you could be traveling 100 kilometers between islands there quite easily, and you're off for days and days. And so there's a long tradition of expert navigators in Micronesia that we're now tapping into studying and using different methods to begin more of a cognitive, fantastic anthropology with them. But it's the cognitive science is only just beginning. So the kind of offshoots for me, I'm always obsessed with space and navigation, but it's led me to work with rats in lab, London taxi drivers, architects, artists, and now Micronesian sailors on canoes, and it's I just enjoy it. I'm out there. I'm in the real world. I'm doing things.
And you run a lab at UCL, the Spiers Lab.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this is primarily around this work, but can you say a bit about what you get up to there?
Currently, so my lab currently has a number of people working on projects. So one of the projects, for example, is how does our brain work when we're hunting? So I've spent my career looking at navigation, but the one shift, it's very simple, hunting. And I'm not interested in the moment you kind of strike and catch the prey. It's the lead up to it. When you think about wolves tracking over open forest, a deer, they can't see it. But how does a pack of wolves hunt down another animal? And we know very, very little about how the brain does this. But it's a very similar mechanism we would expect in navigation. It's just that instead of going to a point in space, you're tracking a moving target in space. And so we're exploring that. Another whole line of research in my lab is around these Micronesian sailors and how they navigate and collaborating with experts there. And then the other major occupation of my time now is in the field of neuroarchitecture and neurodesign, where we're interested in understanding how the built environment, the cities and the buildings we inhabit affects our brain and our health and our well-being. And then how can we use modern methods in neuroscience to help gather information that would be useful for design? Like, how can we better design the cities and buildings we live in for great outcomes in health, cognition, and well-being? And to do that, we should be able to leverage new technologies, new approaches. That's a lot more, will it work? We don't know how well some of this will work, but there's a lot of evidence to suspect it will. And there's a lot of appetite out there to get more information to help us design spaces that are better for everybody and address the inequalities we see. So again, just to take that, I've started out on a journey that's taken me working with rats in a lab to how could we help address issues about the standard of living in areas where there's poverty in cities. It's a spatial question. It's about space. So I've really been very lucky to have that opportunity to do that.
And I noticed at your lab, one of the sponsors is DeepMind, now Google DeepMind. What's that relationship about?
So look, you'll notice that the sponsor was DeepMind, not Google DeepMind. And that's because I was very fortunate to have Demis Hassabis, when he just established DeepMind, he was able to co-sponsor with funding that I had for a particular expert to come work across our labs. So it specifically funded someone called Martin Chadwick, who's now been at Google DeepMind for many years. He was a postdoc in my lab, and so it was that process that allowed us to co-fund it. When Google got involved, it's obviously a lot more difficult to organize sponsored research, but they still do interesting collaborations. But yeah, I mean, I'm very, very grateful. And I was in the same research group that with Demis Hassabis when he was doing his PhD. So it was fantastic talking to Demis in the early days while he was developing ideas for DeepMind. And so seeing what they've achieved now is just fantastic. I really enjoy following what they're up to.
I don't know, Maguire, who you've worked with, was she your PhD supervisor as well? Because I know that she was Demis's PhD supervisor, right. Is that right? And I was going to ask.
No, she was my first imaging postdoc. So I did, after I did my PhD with Neil Burgess and John O'Keefe, I did a number of postdocs, and my last postdoc before becoming a member, like a lecturer, was with Eleanor Maguire. And so it was while we were working on London taxi drivers then. Demis joined the lab and said, I wonder if patients with hippocampal damage who can't remember things, maybe they can't imagine things either. And I was like, no way, they're going to be fine. And he was right, I was wrong. I enjoy that in science. It's like, if you're right all the time, it's why are you bothering? So he took a gamble. He'd read the right papers and was seeing things I hadn't seen. And so these patients really struggled to imagine new experiences. So that was what occupied Demis for a fair bit of his time when he was doing a PhD with Eleanor Maguire and I was doing my postdoc. But yeah, I still catch up with Demis. It's fantastic what they've achieved as a company now. Yeah.
It'd be really interesting to hear a bit more about that. Some of the conversations maybe you had with Demis when you were both a bit younger, and perhaps any conversations you had around AI. Maybe he was sharing you some of his thoughts and ideas of his plans for the future. This is great to hear.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. In the sense of, it's one of those great things in science where you happen to be in a research lab with people with different perspectives and different approaches. And you go for lunch. This was before the pandemic and academia was a bit more relaxed. You'd go for lunch and have discussions about issues. And the thing I took away from Demis was ambition. Was push it, ask what's just his attitude when I was working with Demis was, things aren't as they should be. There's always something we can do here, but it's working out what's the most impactful thing you could do. And he was thinking big, in the way most people were just thinking, I've got this niche study I want to achieve, I'll do this. Demis was, and it definitely rubbed off in the sense of, it's made me think. I mean, I haven't gone on to set up a large company like Demis. I haven't got that interest in shifting out of running a research lab to running an organization. But the thing that really struck me was people invest a lot of their time, 3 or 4 years PhD, doing a topic. Make it on something that's really ambitious. It's better, I think, people do that and it fails, it doesn't quite work, and they try, then they stick to something safe. And so I certainly saw that with Demis, just this, bigger picture thinking that I think would be better if there was more people doing that we would be doing better, I think. But yeah, and it was just a huge pleasure to see him go from I have an idea to at the point at which he joined Google with the company. It was just a joy, if you're following some story like that, and it was great.
Do you remember any thoughts you had around his plans and ideas around AI, and maybe how others, perhaps in other people you guys were hanging out with and talking with, thought about his plans with AI? I know a lot of people at these early days were very skeptical of the progress that could be made in that field.
When Demis was talking about it, he'd had an undergrad, and he'd been studying AI before and he'd obviously set up a company and had to develop the AI for video games. So he'd come with all that experience. But when I first met Demis, this is back in 2004, 2005, AI was not a word people were bandying around. And so even when he was saying we're going to do AI, I was thinking, well, that's kind of had that winter. It's not. And he was completely on the money. He knew this was a rising thing. And the big thing that's happened is the compute power has risen substantially. That was not there back when the first attempts. People just didn't have the power to do these things. And key methods, huge advances in ways of processing data. Things like the things that Jeff Hinton discovered and so on, and others that have just made possible deep learning. And so, so the discussions with Demis would be about these ambitions he had that just seemed way off the scale compared to everyone else I was talking to. And so you sit thinking, really? Is this really what? But when you're talking to someone who's already created a company and sold it to Microsoft, that he's not talking from somewhere of magical dreaming. It's practical. He's going to do this. So I didn't have doubt he would do something incredible with this. And it's just, I think, at the level he's reached, I think I wouldn't necessarily predicted fully that, but I would have predicted, big success. And so, as I say, it's a joy to have known someone to be that successful. And I do think there's a lot of talk about, the journey towards an AGI, a general intelligence that we will see, and how far away that is. There's a lot of skeptics, I'm on the fence. I don't know whether I'm a scientist, so I can say I don't know. The answer is I don't know whether we'll reach that, when we'll reach it. But I would flag up some of the exciting things that DeepMind has done are really about new tools to discover materials, to the AlphaFold, has really changed medicine. These are fantastic outcomes that are not just they're not so fluffy. They're really hard, like they're really important things underlying it. And so that I have a lot of admiration for that. And I think I'd go back. One thing to reflect on there, maybe, like, I really enjoy thinking about space. Like, I'm not that. I like thinking about lots of things, but for me, a lot of things fold into space. So I'm happy not to be in charge of a large company solving lots of different things. I really love working on a particular field, but mainly because it intersects other things, and I get to see those play out. So each person's got to follow their own thing they're passionate about. And I just, been lucky to see a range of people in my career there.
Yeah, so as a final question, I wanted to ask you something, and I'm intrigued if any of your neuroscience work can give you any particular insights here, although I feel like your work may be in a slightly different kind of realm. But the question I've been asking people lately is what it means to live a good life. Do you have any thoughts or insights there?
Yeah, that is an important one. Yeah, it's a hard one. What is a good life, right? It's not a simple answer. And I think you would have to say that there's a kind of deep-seated happiness that you hold that isn't just some superficial, fleeting moment, but that you feel connection with the world. I was talking to someone last night at dinner who said, you've got physical health, you've got mental health, and you've got existential health. And I thought that maybe relates to this question about living a good life, that you've managed to cover all three of those. You're not at the back of your mind worried about you feel confident about your place in the world and how you connect to bigger topics than just me and this table. And so living a good life, I think, but it is, the more you look at it, is helping others. If you think about all the evidence, is the more we can do to help others in society, and raise the state of the world, the better that is. And with my work I've been doing, I think the further I've gone down it, the more I've wanted to push that dimension of living a good life, in the sense of, can we tackle problems, inequalities in the world, which don't obviously appear from studying rats in a lab, but as you go into different topics, you can.
Well, Hugo, thanks so much for speaking today. It was really awesome to chat and fascinating work you're doing. Thanks for your time and good luck with the research from now on.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you enjoyed the Human Podcast, please consider subscribing. I hope to see you soon.